Good afternoon. I'm Vali Nasser, professor at Johns Hopkins University, and it's great to welcome everybody to this session, tantalizingly entitled How to Engage Iran, which is the question of the day. We have three excellent panelists with us, Jojo Duan, who's an assistant professor at Tsinghua University in Beijing, Hoda Raouf, who is the head of the Iranian Studies Unit at Egyptian Center for Strategic Studies, and Ali Baez, who's the senior advisor to the president and project director for Iran at the International Crisis Group. So I want to put the first set of questions about what are the actual obstacles to engaging Iran before talking about modalities and how that might happen. And I want to start with you, Jojo. We've heard already a number of times today in other panels concerns that exist with Iran's regional presence, particularly in light of the ongoing war in Gaza and the role that Iran has had with Hamas, with Hezbollah in Iraq, as well as in Yemen. So going forward in terms of engaging with Iran, I think one of the questions, both for countries in the West, as well as Iran's neighbors in the region, is where does the issue of Iran's proxies fit in any kind of an engagement with Iran, both I think as an obstacle and also if the issue of Iran's proxies was going to be on the table.
Yeah, thanks, Professor. And I want to thank the opportunity that is being given to me to come to this forum. I think when we are talking about the threat from Iran to its neighboring countries, there's at least two aspects. One aspect is perception. Because Iran is a country with a long history and it's a big country in this region. So as long as it's unified and it's big enough, it will be perceived as a potential hegemon in the region and the threat to its neighboring countries, which is very natural. And in terms of reality, I think Iran, of course, after 1979, there is an export of the revolution to the surrounding regions, which is reasonably being perceived as a threat, especially to the Arab countries. But when we are talking about the proxies that Iran is building, which is become emerging, I think specifically after the Arab Spring, which has become a kind of the same structure or same set of the game among all regional countries, because there is a collapse of the former nation state in the region, like Yemen and Syria and Iraq. And it's become every country's game to support at least one or two groups in the territory of the collapsed nation state. And Iran, of course, has been one of the successful countries to do that. So as a result, we can see right now Iran is control all those proxies in Iraq, Yemen, and Lebanon. But I would say the U.S. containment of the Iran, security threat to the Arab countries has been very successful. There's obviously a decline of the incentives for Iran for export revolution to the region. And I think the perception of the threat have changed dramatically ever since after the October 7th of the last year, because there is a more aggressive actions from the Israel, and the unlimited U.S. support for Israel's action has already changed people's perception about the threat that surrounded them. I think by that case, Iran maybe already become like a secondary threat to the Arab countries now, which is the most dramatic change, I think, from the last year. So what going forward, I think the Trump administration new policy towards Iran will be very important. For me, I'm still a little bit optimistic because at least I think Trump has been perceived as a most hawkish politicians in the United States of Iran. But remember, back in the Cold War, only Nixon can go to China. So I think Trump could be the person to negotiate terms with Iran, and that is possible to happen during his administration. But that have been said, there are limitations of this negotiation. I think for the regional countries, they're already become more and more adaptive to new reality. And there is a signals of the ending of the isolation for Iran, and the regional country has begun to engage Iran incrementally.
So let me just quickly follow up on what you said. So if Trump is Nixon going to China, the key question becomes that do you see it feasible that there would be negotiations on the regional forces that Iran has, all of them at once, or are there certain ones that might be a priority for negotiations? And then attached to that is a question that we often don't ask: what is it that Iran actually can deliver? Because often the assumption is that Iran can basically turn this off completely.
Yeah, I think, at the first years or first times of the Trump administration, I think each side were definitely, testing waters, as we witnessed in this year. I think both sides also realize they have their own vulnerabilities. For example, for Israeli side, of course, they have the US support, but they cannot always intercept the Iranian missiles. So as long as I think both sides realize their own vulnerability, there is a possibility that could come to the table and negotiate the terms. And of course, I think the biggest obstacle is dismantle of the Iranian proxies in the region. I think it is not easy for Iran to give up its strategic advantage that have been built for many years. So we will see, but there is possibility, I think.
Yeah. Excellent. So, I mean, there's no shortage of obstacles to negotiations. So, the regional issue, of course, is front of mind these days. But I want to ask you, Hoda, about the domestic situation in Iran, because it's easy to forget that only 2 years ago, there was major uprisings in Iran around the women life freedom movement that had a big impact, if you would, particularly in Europe. And it was a big factor in the decline of relations at that point in time. So and we're hearing obviously news that EU3 is contemplating talking to Iran, although at the beginning about nuclear issue. But ultimately, this issue of human rights in Iran and the domestic situation in Iran would be on the table. I want to ask you, what's your assessment in terms of how important the sort of this domestic factor in Iran is in engagement with the West and particularly with Europe?
Thanks, Professor. Thank you for having me here. According to human rights file and the European situation, of course, the EU imposed sanctions on Iran regarding human rights violation, nuclear activities, and recently the military support for Russia in the Ukraine war. And these sanctions regularly renewed. But I think nothing or real or genuine change has been happened in Iran. Of course, Europeans want to see change in the government behavior or policies related to human rights, women-led protest, and freedom of expression and extra. But of course, Iranian refused to do any changes. And of course, European, somehow they want to show support for the victims. They want the offender to change their policy and behavior, but the Iranian regime never. And we can find that there are many sanctions imposed on Iran, about more than 207 individuals sanctioned, more than 42 entities sanctioned in Iran, but the Iranian ignored any European resolution. Is this obstacle for engaging Iran in negotiation with the European, as for your question? I think it's not obstacle in itself, because the human rights, it's among many issues. For example, we have nuclear, the regional behaviors, Russian war. So we can find that if European, this is what Iranian think, if European and Iranian achieve compromises on these issues, so they can deal with the human rights.
That's interesting. So let me ask you this. Now, since the uprisings happened in Iran, there has been a presidential election, and a more reformist / moderate president has come to power. Do you think that has any impact in where human rights fits in Europe's thinking about Iran?
Actually, you can say that Pezeshkian, as a reformist president in this time, after this challenging uprising for Iran, he is at a critical crossroad, because, 1 month ago, the Guardian Council has issued and approved a bill on hijab, and it's in the parliament after that. And there is no official response from Pezeshkian, and the Iranian wait for any response, especially during his election campaign, he promised to stop the morality police and to give more margin in rights for women, but nothing happened. So he is forced either to comply with the new bill or to defy. But also something happened that IRGC, recently they launched a new plan to counter the opponents for hijab. So even if you have already a reformist government, nothing happened. And this is why I think the Iranian regime won't let the election come with a reformist president. It wasn't for pursuing a reformist, domestic reformist agenda, but because to send the message for the West that Iran is moving towards a reform, a de-escalation among the regional escalations that happened 1 year ago. So the message was to the West, not to the domestic.
Very interesting. Now, just before going to Ali, I want to follow up on one other point you raised. You raised the issue of Iran's support for Russia in the Ukraine war as something that is particularly irksome for Europeans. Now, so it's just a sort of a hypothetical, provocative question. Let's say President Trump comes in and resolves the Ukraine issue, or has a very different theory about the Ukraine issue, and that war goes in the direction of ending. If the war is no longer an issue, would Europe's attitude towards Iran change in terms of engagement in that light?
The question for me? Or
yes, for you. No, because you mentioned the Russian issue, so I just want to probe that whether Europe's position on Iran, particularly countries like Germany, who are very, very particularly insistent on the problematic of Iran supplying weapons to Russia. But if the war itself is no longer an issue, whether that removes a major obstacle to engagement between Iran and Europe.
I think Iran will not sacrifice relation with Russia, because it's a strategic ally for it, and it needed in Security Council for voting for the new trend that pushing a multipolar system which contain Iran, China, Russia. So I think they may compromise, but not to decline its strategic relation with Russia.
Thank you. Now, Ali, sort of want to ask you about what might be the most important area of engagement or motivation for engagement, which is the nuclear issue. Now, since the United States came out of the nuclear deal and then failure to achieve an agreement for returning to the nuclear deal, Iran's nuclear program has advanced significantly. And even last week, we saw a censure of Iran at the Board of Governors of the IAEA. So, and now we also have a new administration coming in Washington. We have a new administration in Iran, which returned all of those who had negotiated the original deal to high positions in diplomacy. So what do you see the prospects, given where we are, and maybe say a bit about where we are on the nuclear file, and what is the degree of opening to engaging on this issue?
Thank you very much, Vali, and thank you, Med, for the invitation. It's great to be back at the Eternal City. And this seems to be a perennial challenge. 21 years of nuclear crisis, and we're still figuring out how to resolve it. 10 years ago, if you would ask Western policymakers, prioritize your 3 biggest issues with Iran, they would say nuclear program first, then missiles, then Iran's regional policies. If you would ask GCC and Israel, what are your biggest problems with Iran, they would put it in a different order. They would say missile and regional almost at the same level, and then nuclear. And I think in a way, the West has ended up where the region was now. The nuclear issue has been deprioritized, despite the fact that it's a bigger problem than ever. It's a bigger problem at different levels. Physically, the program is bigger than ever. It's more advanced than it has ever been. When President Trump walked into the Oval Office, it would take, in 2017, it would take about 6 days for Iran to enrich enough fissile material for a single nuclear weapon, the so-called breakout time. That timeline right now is 6 days. 6 days, right? Not 12 months, 6 days. In addition to that, Iran has other pathways to nuclear weapons, the so-called sneak out option, because it's now 3 years that Iran has been producing advanced centrifuges that it could have potentially stocked in places that we're not aware of. Iran is no longer complying with some of the transparency measures in the JCPOA that required Iran to notify the agency, the IAEA, when it's about to start operating or creating a new nuclear facility. So it has now the possibility of developing a clandestine program and sneaking out towards a nuclear weapon. Psychologically, we're also at a very different point. 10 years ago, nobody in Iran would openly talk about nuclear weapons. Remember, there's a supreme leader religious edict, whether you want to believe it or not, but it is there, which made it very difficult for people to advocate for nuclear weapons, even the expert community. Then it started changing as of 2018. The experts started talking about it, then the former officials started talking about it, then the sitting officials started talking about it, then the military officials started talking about it, and now it's the norm. Members of parliament and newspapers, everybody's talking and advocating about the fact that now that Iran's regional deterrence has been weakened, now that its conventional deterrence has proven insufficient to protect the country from Israeli attack, maybe they should go for the ultimate deterrent. So it's a bigger problem than ever. But the scope of solutions is smaller than ever. And again, it's because this is a program that is now so advanced that doesn't fit into a small box with short-term transparency measures and restrictions. The international consensus that existed in the form of the P5+1 no longer exists. The Europeans are not willing to sit at the table with Russia and negotiate about how to restrict Iran's nuclear program, even though it's an issue of common interest. Sanctions relief is no longer really a viable option because it's 20 years of Europeans and Americans failing to deliver on sanctions relief. And that's a long story. I mean, you and I have co-authored the book on that. And there are pressures on the timeline. The resolution, UN resolution that enshrined the nuclear deal in 2015 will expire in October of next year. With it, the Western ability to keep this file in the Security Council. If they want to snap back the UN sanctions, they will have to do it in June, July. President Trump comes to office in January. By the time we go through the confirmation process and the cabinet is in place, it's probably March. So you basically literally have 3 months to figure out a solution to avoid a snapback showdown. And if the US forces France and the UK are still members of the JCPOA and can use the snapback option, return all the UN sanctions, we know what Iran will do. It would withdraw from the Non-Proliferation Treaty, which is what North Korea did in 2003, and we all know how that story ended. So it's not looking promising at all.
So let me follow with that. I think the point you make about Iran's program being simultaneously much more advanced and dangerous, and yet being a lower priority, it's a very interesting configuration of this issue. So, but at least one solution that these days in the West is being put on the table is that Israel could just bomb Iran's nuclear program. Definitely, the Israelis are talking about it on the back of the argument that they have eliminated or seriously downgraded Iran's air defense systems, or that potentially the US could be. So at the same time as this is being seen as not a priority, the military option against it is also being talked about, which means there's another psychological, if you would, barrier being broken in the West. So I just want to ask how realistic a solution is that to Iran's nuclear program, if that option was on the table?
Well, the problem is you can't really bomb the knowledge out of the head of Iranian nuclear scientists. And once that threshold is achieved, which already is the case, Iran is already a threshold nuclear weapon state, it is a one-way street. It's just a question of a political decision. If you look at US intelligence reporting on this, they always say that Iran has not yet made the decision to go nuclear. They have the capability, but they have not made the decision because it's no longer a technical issue. It's a political decision. And Israel can set back Iran's nuclear program for sure, but then it would drive it underground and it would create that political will to develop the ultimate deterrent. There is also the opposite of this calculation, which is that for the Iranians, yes, they talk about going nuclear, but it's easier said than done. I talked about the timeline to get enough fissile material for a nuclear weapon enriched to weapons grade. That's not a bomb. It's like having the ingredients for a cake. You still have to bake it into a cake. The weaponization process takes 6 to 18 months. In that period, Iran would be vulnerable to attacks. If it makes even the political decision to go nuclear, it might in fact invite an attack, not deter one. And finally, this year in 2024, Iran itself has attacked 2 nuclear weapon states, Pakistan and Israel. So clearly it has demonstrated that unconventional deterrence doesn't stop conventional attacks on one's territory. So it doesn't necessarily solve Iran's problem either. And that's why I'm saying neither side has a military or a breakout or nuclearization or nuclear option really to get rid of this issue. The only solution is nuclear, is diplomacy. But, sorry, yes, nuclear diplomacy. But the thing is, we've reached a stage in Europe that I think even if Iran puts its entire nuclear program on the table and says that I'm going to dismantle all of my centrifuges, completely shut down my nuclear program, the Europeans would say, then, what about missile transfers to Russia? What about support for Hezbollah? And I used to say this about Israel 10 years ago, but again, I think it's now much broader perception that if your issue is not uranium enrichment, but Iranian enrichment, you're basically arguing for no diplomatic solution.
So let me just ask you, you touched on this. It almost sounds like the attitudes in the West have changed from Iran shall never go nuclear to almost tacitly accepting Iran can go nuclear, and then so what, right? One question is whether the West was bluffing, that it really was worried about Iran going nuclear before, or have they changed their calculation? But realistically, let's say if Iran makes all the wrong calculations and decides to go nuclear and you cannot stop it, what is the consequence here?
Well, there are all sorts of consequences for the international non-proliferation regime, for the region. Again, I don't think there is a path to nuclear weaponization that doesn't cross through a confrontation, a military confrontation between Iran and or US and Israel. We would have the regional war that in previous panels, people were saying we've been lucky that it hasn't, we've come very close to it, but it actually has not happened. So there's that risk. Then there is the risk of a domino effect, that if Iran has nuclear weapons, why not Saudi Arabia? Why not Turkey? Why not Egypt? Again, it's a formula for further instability in a region that is already in so much turmoil.
So one last follow-up before moving on. I mean, you know, for a very long time, we thought, at least I among some thought, that Iran's nuclear program, the buildup of it was largely to build leverage for negotiations, to lift sanctions or get other things. But it almost sounds like you're implying that either the program has got so big that it will just continue until full nuclearization, or that the calculation in Tehran has changed, namely the program is no longer just leverage for negotiations, but actually has military deterrence ends in of itself.
So I think they are at an inflection point of finally deciding, what is this program for? Is it leverage? But in that case, the West, and especially the United States, would have to be willing to deliver sanctions relief, which is a big, big question mark. And if there was one person who can do it, and we'll talk about this more, is probably President Trump. Or is it for weaponization? And are we willing, like other 9 nuclear weapon states, pay the price for it? I think we're really at that inflection point. But if we are to think about a solution, I think we have to think about it in a very different way. About a year ago, you and I co-authored a piece in Foreign Affairs, which basically argued the UAE has a civilian nuclear program. The Saudis want to have a civilian nuclear program. Iran has a nuclear program that is still civilian. And the US is trying to negotiate deals with all of these countries individually. Why not put all of them in the same basket and negotiate a sub-regional deal between, basically triangulate Iran, GCC, and the US, and come up with an entirely different formula, which could be the first step towards, I'm not starry-eyed enough to say regional security architecture or anything like that, but at least a step in the right direction in terms of a much more inclusive solution. And then when you have the region involved, you can also start gradually addressing other areas of concern as well.
Thank you. So you raised the region. Let me turn to you, Huda, that, you know, for a very long time, in terms of the threat perceptions that the Gulf countries and the rest of Middle East countries like Egypt, Jordan, et cetera, had, the relations with Iran was very fraught, largely over issues of missiles, Iran's proxies, et cetera. And we had, for a very long time, only 3 countries that were in a place to mediate between Iran, other Arab countries, or the West, which was Oman, Qatar, and Iraq to some extent. We've seen, ironically, a sea change of attitude in the Arab world towards Iran, and perhaps in Iran towards the Arab world, exactly when the issue of militias and proxies is still there, and may have even been aggravated. The nuclear issue is still there. The missile issue is worse than before. So I want to ask you, you know, what do you think is the motivation, or what's going on in the Arab world in terms of how it now thinks about Iran? And then what are the limitations, if you would, how far this can go? In other words, we're sort of, is it peace breaking out, or are we just seeing a sort of reduction of tensions?
Well, as for Arab countries and relation with Iran, I believe, and you all noticed when Iran asked during Raisi, the previous president, when Ibrahim Raisi came with the agenda of the diplomacy of neighboring diplomacy, most of Arab countries, they respond positively to his policy. And he asked to improve relation, for example, with Egypt, to raise the level of diplomatic relation We witnessed the deal between Iran and Saudi Arabia. Emirates improve its relation with Iran. And this because during Ibrahim Raisi. Now Iran, they are keen or seeking to maintain this policy, neighboring diplomacy, because they want Trump when come to in his office officially, so he will find the new dynamics in the region. He will find reconciliation, sort of improving in relation between Iran and Arab countries. But still, the Arab countries they have their own, limitation in improving relation with Iran. This is because Iran has determinants in its foreign policy or its regional strategy, which is based on, networking or having relation with the regional proxies. And these proxies are located inside the Arab system. So Iran continue to interfere in domestic affairs for Arab states. And this is one of the, if we come to Egypt, because you asked me about Egypt, Egypt determinants of its foreign policy based on not to interfere in other affairs. And this is what it asks or going to ask for Iran. If they want to improve this relation, you should stop supporting the non-state actors, the militia, interfering in other Arab affairs. And Iran, its strategy, which is forward defense, is based on creating these non-state actors and supporting them by military, finance, and whatever, and engaging them in the center or the government or the institutions, and become more powerful and have more influence than the national state itself. For example, we have Hezbollah is powerful than the army. We have what happened in Yemen, militia, Hashd al-Sha'bi in Iraq. So if Iran wants to improve relation or to go further in improving relation with Arab states, she should stop doing these things. And I think unlikely for Iran, because those factors are main determinants in its regional strategy.
Very good. So let me just follow up and ask you, it's very clear what you laid out. What is the limitation to going to the next level in normalization? But insofar as Arab countries have engaged Iran, either those who have normalized or those who have engaged Iran without normalization, like receiving Iran's foreign minister, Bahrain, Egypt, Jordan, what do you think they're getting out of this? What's the incentive in the Arab world to actually engage Iran at this point? Or what benefit has it come to the Arab world from this engagement?
The benefits come to Arab world, I thought you asked me for the benefits that come to Iran if it changes somehow its behavior in the region, so to be not isolated regionally. And this is what happened 1 week ago. We have the Chief Army of Saudi Arabia. He has visited Iran, and Iran make a good propaganda for this visit, by the way, because this is signals that Saudi Arabia is good with Iran and they're not regional tensions, so no need for maximum pressure policies that Trump will come with. So I think that Arab countries do their best to contain Iran as it's Iran role.
Yeah, I understand. Very good. So continuing on the regional issue, Jojo, I want to ask you, in March 2023, China helped broker an agreement between Iran and Saudi Arabia to normalize their relations. I think the role that China played was perhaps in the West surprising. There was an expectation that yes, you could host them, and but the fact that you could actually broker an agreement, which, as Huda says, had at least lasted to this point. So, and the understanding was that China has economic leverage on both. As Iran relies for its sale of oil and many of its imports on China, and China is also a big economic partner of Saudi Arabia as well. So I wanted to ask you that can that leverage still work to deepen the relations beyond, to push to the next level? And also, does China have that motivation to make sure that this normalization stands or is actually deepened?
Yeah. So first, I think I want to disagree a little bit. I don't think China have much leverage over Saudi Arabia and Iran. Of course, China is a big partner with Iran and Saudi Arabia economically, but not so much politically and militarily. So I think why they choose China is not because the leverage, is because the trust. And trust is built on the neutrality of China in the regional affairs. So I think the China's mediation with Iran and Saudi or Richmond, we can categorize into two steps. So I think the first phase is during the COVID. I think because of the decrease of the oil price, both Iran and Saudi Arabia, especially Saudi Arabia, feels the vulnerability of this economy. And there is a huge fatigue, not only in the West, but also during, with the regional countries about the regional conflict. So they already have, had many negotiations with the help of the Oman and Iraq. And after that, probably they think China could be a bigger and, much more important guarantor of this regime. And as far as I know, the ongoing negotiation during the COVID have happened in China for several times, between the Saudis and Iranians. And at the end, it's actually the Saudi side, which is, I think, is the weaker side, decided they want to get a regime with Iran, and then the sign agreement in Beijing. But the first phase of the agreement, I would say, is very much in principle. So the two, already, countries have been cut at the diplomatic relations, want to come together and, talk again. But in the second phase, which could be more important, I think, just 1 week ago, I think this is the news that doesn't exist so much in the Western media, that the trilateral, coordination community between China, China, Saudi Arabia, and Iran happened held a meeting in Riyadh, and there is a much which is a higher promotion of the relationship into the second phase. Here I'm quoting the official media outlet. So what is the content inside the agreement of the second agreement? First, they say they will apply to the Beijing agreement that already be signed almost 1.5 years ago. Another is that they will be adhered to UN Charter, ICO Charter, and international law. And they will enhance their mutual exchange of visits, including the academic change and the commercial change. Another is there is appreciation from Iranian side about the pilgrimage service by the Saudi side. And they will sign agreement to avoid the double taxation. And there is a common condemnation of Israelis' attack on Iranian territories, not Lebanon's or Palestinians, on the Iranian territorial integrity, and is a call for a halt of military actions in Palestine and Lebanon. And they ask for a political solution of Yemen question according to international principle and UN under UN supervision. So I think there's much more content after this first phase. So with coordination of China and the joint committee, the bilateral relationship did have a huge upgrade. And in the future, I think China has a huge motivation to build such a unity among the Middle Eastern countries, because I think China is foreseeing a decoupling with the United States, and there could be a huge competition in the future. So as long as there is a unity among the Middle Eastern countries, they could play a role as an intermediate or at least autonomous role between China and the United States.
Thank you. Although it remains to be seen, interestingly, whether President Trump's desire to downsize China's economic and international role extends to also trying to do that in the Middle East as well, and what kind of an impact that would have. Lastly, Ali, I know there's news of, for instance, Europeans and Iranians E3 meeting with Iran over the nuclear issue. I wanted to ask you, let's assume that these negotiations get engaged and there's motivations on both sides going forward. What does, what are the modalities of nuclear negotiations now look like? I mean, how we might engage? Is it still going to be the P5+1? Is there different modalities? And what is likely to be the end result of success this time? You know, what would we define success as if negotiations restart?
So when the Iranians were in New York on the sidelines of UNGA in September, they had conversations with the Europeans about the future of nuclear diplomacy. And again, this tight timeline that I mentioned, brainstorming about solutions. And they agreed to continue the conversations in October, both with the E3 and with the EU, and then also indirectly with the US and Oman. And then tensions escalated between Iran and Israel, and all of that got derailed. So we're now getting back to what was previously planned. But I'm not optimistic about this particular engagement, because the reality is, if we want to be honest, the Europeans are stakeholders for sure, but the real leverage is with the United States. And no one at this point knows for sure what kind of approach the Trump administration is going to adopt. That will be the most determining factors. So the Iranians can speak with the Europeans, can come up with some ideas, but it's not going to go anywhere until we have clarity about the Trump administration's approach. Now, on the Iranian side, there are several schools of thought about what to do with the Trump administration. On one extreme, you have the group that I call the intransigent. Those who say there is no deal to be had with the Trump administration. They want a zero-sum solution. This is a return to 12 conditions that Secretary Pompeo imposed, that they want to go back to zero enrichment, which was the Bush administration's policy. We would rather double down on our forward defense, on our missiles and drones, and our nuclear program, and just wait out the next 4 years. And yes, sanctions are painful, but how much more painful it can be compared to what happened in 2018, 2019. Then at the other end of the spectrum, you have those who I'll call the transformatives, those who believe that you can get a deal with Trump that you couldn't with Obama or Biden, because he can strong-arm Congress into agreeing to terms that were impossible previously. And the bar in terms of the standard of what is an acceptable deal might be very different for President Trump. I mean, he has said at times what I believe is very hard to sell, which is just a nuclear deal. He has said, the only thing I want is for Iran not to have nuclear weapons. He hasn't talked about missiles or drones or human rights or proxies or anything like that. Then in between, you have those who are for transactional deals, maybe one-offs, or maybe a package of gesture for gesture or step by step by both sides. And then you have those who, I would call them the performatives, basically believe in performative diplomacy with the Trump administration, which is what Kim Jong-un did in the Trump administration's first term, just to limit the amount of harm that he could inflict on Iran. And so these two schools of thought, both in Washington in terms of what to do with Iran, maximum pressure, or maybe engagement, maybe deal-making, and the schools of thought in Iran would determine whether the future of these engagements that we're seeing now between Iran and the Europeans would be meaningful or not.
Well, thank you. Unfortunately, we have to leave it at this. We're at the end of time. Please join me to thank our excellent panelists for this conversation. Thank you.